Hi there, and welcome to a new episode of Impact Talks. Today we have Raphael Arar with us. He's a designer and artist who works with complex systems. I'm really excited to have you on. Please tell the people what you do.
Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. Call myself this mostly designer, artist, researcher, who for the past handful of years has been really exploring complex systems, primarily in R&D spaces, research and development spaces. So that's been looking at things like artificial intelligence and emerging technologies, how those emerging technologies apply to aspects of society, economics, education, and that I think really sums up my activities and my interests. Pretty broad and far-reaching.
What led up to such a diverse skill set? Not every creative soul can operate with complex systems like AI, for instance, and the other way around, not many of those, coders can do creative work. I find that only a few tend to excel in both. But what led up to that? Did you study this? Where did the interest come from?
Yeah, I think what I found is that folks who are interested in systems in particular have a hard time choosing one specific discipline. I think as a result, you find these people who are, often who start in multidisciplinary ways, exploring different domains. And at a young age, I was, I'd say, pretty interested in kind of finding intersections, taking one thing and another thing and two things that are unlike one another and trying to see, what happens if you combine the two, almost like a conceptual or an intellectual mashup, right? And so that led me to explore a variety of different things and I'd say higher level education. So my undergraduate, I was exploring economics. I was exploring more of the humanities and music, and often, as I learned more tools, that led me into the digital space. And so then it was just trying to explore and pick up new skills. I think I'm always someone who's interested in acquiring new skills and thinking through how those apply and really trying to make sense of the world and using a variety of different lenses. And I think that interest plus, a strong background, a family influence of being involved in the arts, led me to really thinking about artists as, honestly, some of the most creative lenses on complex problems, right? So in addition to some of the scientists who are exploring complexity and some of the wicked problems that we face as society, the artist lens I often saw as actually a valuable way of shifting mindsets, changing hearts, changing minds, and kind of trying to alter the conversation that way. So it's a little bit about how that kind of trajectory and that meandering set of interests evolved and emerged.
So now you kind of explained how you got into it with your studies, but can you maybe explain how it's changed throughout your career? Because when I looked you up, one of the things that kept popping up is you did a lot within education. I saw you were working at Khan Academy, you were adjunct professor, all these things. How did the skills that you learn apply to education, or why did you dive so deep into education?
Yeah, really great question. So my dad was an educator. My dad was a math teacher. I think my parents really instilled a deep appreciation for learning, right? I think they both immigrated to the States, not very well off by any means, and they kind of ingrained in my sister and me the way that you actually get through life is and some of the best parts of life are actually just acquiring knowledge, and so that's always been an interest of mine. And then as I got older, it's kind of been a way of also trying to instill that interest in others. And so I think this started in graduate school. So I went to the California Institute of the Arts for graduate school to really explore a hybridized education in both art making as well as design. In fact, a lot of my thesis work were how the two are different and yet how they engage in feedback loops together. And so that manifested through both craft, but also through concept. And it was through getting an MFA that I was able to start teaching at the university level, and found that I was, quite interested in that, especially engaging in kind of critical theory and exploring that avenue. And so that's something that I've kept up since graduate school is just trying to keep a foot in academia. I think I enjoy really doing a lot of work that drives industry forward or changes narratives and kind of culture and the way that we do things in our current economic system, but simultaneously trying to really inspire and provoke interesting conversations with some of the new folks who are emerging or will be emerging in the field, or whether that's in industry or academia or as artists. It's that kind of exploration. And then, what led me to Khan Academy was I was pretty steeped in, I would say, big tech companies where I was working with and for companies like IBM and Apple and Google. And then I ended up meeting the head of design at Khan Academy, and she was telling me that Khan Academy had this R&D team that was looking at early product development. And so that's what really got my wheels turning in terms of how do you think about emerging spaces, right? What does early product development mean for this concept of democratizing education, and pushing that conversation forward. So actually thinking about how you scale education as opposed to my one class a semester at the university setting.
So what was your conclusion? How do you democratize knowledge? How do you scale education? What are some conclusions you took from your time there?
That's a great question. I think one of the challenging parts of working at Khan Academy at a time like now, right? Wasn't too long ago that I left Khan Academy. Was that at least even in the States, we were looking at the public school system in the United States, and the digital divide is pretty real, right? I think in 2019, and what I mean by the digital divide is in 2019, and I believe that the statistics have changed quite a bit since then, about 30% of the country did not have internet access at home. And we saw that exacerbate during the pandemic, right? Kids who couldn't go to school actually were not able to do schoolwork because they had no access to that kind of infrastructure. Different, depending on the school system, they would actually use bus drivers and buses to drive around different neighborhoods with Wi-Fi hotspots, so that kids could get online for free. And this was at some of the wealthier school districts. And so it really got me frustrated because we could make this amazing free online education platform. And for those who are not familiar, Khan Academy's mission is to provide a free world-class education to anyone, anywhere, primarily at the K through 12 level. And I would say it's making amazing strides at that. However, if the infrastructure isn't there to support that, you've got kind of a broad swath of the country and the world, for that matter, who can't access that information. And so it got me interested in working on problems much deeper than that. But so ultimately, there's an order of operations behind how you actually disseminate some of that educational material.
Can you dive deeper into practicalities that you discovered and continue your story, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so with respect to the content itself, one of the things that we worked on very deeply, if you think about, so put those problems aside, assume that a kid has the ability to get online and get access to education, right? One of the bigger questions, especially on my end, I was leading design for the learning experience. One of the bigger questions that we started wrestling with is how do we actually get kids intrinsically motivated in an educational experience? And by that matter, I mean, so we can think about motivation on two fronts, really. We think about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And so extrinsic motivation is really, I'm doing the thing so I can get an A. I want to get the grade. I want to get the gold star. And Khan Academy has that. They had certain gamification aspects. There are points that you get. You get, certain celebratory messages after you complete an exercise, 5 out of 5, etc. So you're kind of trying to get that like reward at the end. And one of the bigger questions is that we started to wrestle with is like, is there a way to actually transform someone who might come into the platform extrinsically motivated into an intrinsically motivated learner, right? I actually want to learn math because I enjoy math, because the process of learning math is enjoyable for me. So it was a very challenging question to wrestle with, especially at a nonprofit that has limited resources to actually execute on some of those problems. And the big takeaway was really the way you get kids intrinsically motivated, at least one of the ways you get kids intrinsically motivated is you have to connect the dots between why something like learning algebra is important to what matters to the kid, right? So if the kid wants to be an astronaut, you have to tell them why algebra is important on that trajectory to learning how to be an astronaut. And doing that in a way of, creating personalized paths, saying, what do you actually want to do for a living, and being able to select among a number of options. So we were starting to explore and create prototypes around aspects like this. And I think we started to move the conversation forward.
What do you do if the child says something like, I want to be a salesperson, I don't know, where you don't need like algebra, I guess, or like any profession that I'm not thinking of right now, and they're not motivated by math? How do you convert them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the tricky part is then to try and find avenues where it is important, right? So I don't know, you think about, I would say that some of the basic skills at a K through 12 level apply to all professions, all kind of, career trajectories, if you will. A salesperson, you could say, well, you're going to have to try to do things in Excel spreadsheets and figure out, the number of calls, or, you tie in kind of certain problems that even if they are automated by technology, right, or someone else is actually doing that job, you could actually show them why it's important, right? Show them how they could take an input from something like a challenging math problem and convert it into something that's useful for them and what they're interested in. So that ultimately, I think, would be how you make that connection. But it becomes very challenging when you have a multiplicity of things that a kid is interested in. And there are new jobs and new paths emerging all the time, right? And so managing the different avenues and trajectories that a child might go in is something that came to a front quite a bit.
So when these problems arise, what do you usually do? Do you program something? Is it like a coaching session with children that you do? What did you find was the most scalable way to change the extrinsic motivation to an intrinsic one?
Yeah, so I can comment on that in a couple ways, and one of which I think hones in on the process, right? When I was working at IBM Research, I had the good fortune of working with some of the notable practitioners and academics in the discipline of participatory design. And when you think about participatory design, ultimately, I can try and give a very, try to sum up as best as I can participatory design. It's the idea of the people who are actually using the product or using the desired solution know better than the designers what they actually want or need, right? So they should be active members in the design process. They should be engaged as co-designers, right? And so you can actually think about participatory design on a gradient of sorts. There's the extreme version where it's just, okay, users, people, you design you collectively, we'll get you together, designer acts as facilitator, you collectively come up with the solution together. And this can work really well if you have a cohort of individuals who really have solid ideas of what they need. Maybe it's a specific discipline in a very skilled profession, right? Or there's the reality, which has often happened to me in industry, which is to say that the people are like, well, that's why we hired you. Please, show us a solution. And then it becomes kind of a back and forth, right? And so when we think about the context of education and you try to have co-design sessions or participatory design sessions with kids, they're often like, I don't know, or they don't want to engage, and so then it becomes like just trying to have fun exercises lined up that get them thinking about certain things that they might want to do, right? So we would come up with exercises like this or that. When you think about a reward, would you rather have an A on your report card or a high five from your classmate, right? What means more to you, right? And so that starts to get into this idea of like, okay, are they interested in more of the social reward component or the grade, or is it a grade or a bag of candy, right? For example. So we started creating exercises like that, and then it would start to open up more of this conversation and the dialogue, right? And then you could think through just different ways that started to unfold, with the goal of eventually getting into some sketching, right? We're talking about a software product here. Ultimately, like we want, these kids are online on their computers playing games all the time. Like we want them to be involved in the brainstorming session, but they're not trained in the discipline of thinking that way, of thinking like a product designer. And so ultimately it requires a little bit more work and guidance to get them at least thinking in that conversation. And then the same thing goes with their teachers, right? Getting teachers involved in terms of like what matters to teachers. Same sort of conversation ends up happening, but it's just different angles, right?
When you were at IBM Research, was it mostly research that was happening there, or was it more practical applications that you rolled out and actually saw results?
So it was both, right? So IBM Research is I would say, a really unique spot. And in general, corporate research, you think about like the big names in corporate research throughout history, Xerox PARC, for example, right? Some of these R&D labs. IBM Research has maintained that legacy, right? It's I think there are about, when I left, there were 2,000 researchers for a 400,000 person company. So it's quite small. And the goal of the research arm was to really create impact in a variety of different ways. And that changed throughout the years. But in general, it was kind of I would say an 80-20 rule of 80% you want to have impact to the business, and 20% was kind of intellectual impact, and that could be patents, publications, etc. But the 80% was really research, applied research, right? We want to create prototypes, see results from those prototypes, and ultimately think through, could this be an entirely new business line for IBM? Could this be a new product? And you could think about it in a variety of different angles, right? Am I creating an entirely new sector? Like IBM ended up having a blockchain sector, for example. that was spun out of research. Someone created a research prototype, pitched the idea, and then it evolved to be a whole business unit, right? When I was there, I worked with a sociologist, and we actually collaborated on kind of thought capital, right? We actually contributed patents, publications around the concept, the topic of conversation design. This was pretty nascent at the time. Now you have chatbots all over the place, but we actually created a toolkit, a guide, published a couple books around conversational user experience design. And then we ended up creating prototypes, right? And many of those prototypes were used in partnership with clients. We worked with a couple, major airlines, for example, to create an e-commerce experience of almost like a travel guide experience. And so we created some prototypes around that.
So you're telling me that the first chatbots that were rolled out within big airlines was through that research that you did?
I don't know if it was really. There were a lot of them that actually rolled out because of that, with a couple airlines that I probably can't mention. But it was around this time when I feel like the conversation was just starting, 2016. You were seeing a lot of it evolve, and we actually had a couple prototypes with. So you may have experienced a chatbot that was inspired by some of the research work that we were doing, because it was directly in the market.
And so, grabbing it back to education, as we're still kind of on that, and it's a very fascinating thing for me because almost everybody who has children or nieces, nephews, whatever, has seen it and experienced it during these times. As we kind of entered these times in 2020, and now obviously it's like 2022, 2 years. What have you seen that was done really, really well in the education space? Hybrid learning, you mentioned at the beginning, was something you looked into, the user experience as well. And what are some things that you really didn't like and could have been better?
It's a hard question. I think in general, there's so much room for exploration in the educational experience. It's a hot area in tech, and has been for a while because it is such a difficult problem space. It's extremely difficult. And I'm really not a fan of techno solutionism for it, right? I don't think there's going to be a one size fits all technology type solution for education. So I've seen bits and pieces. I think there's some online learning examples, depending on the user base, that have worked really well. I think, for example, coding platforms. There are a number that actually are quite good because it makes sense with that medium. You're actually learning programming, and programming is. I would make the argument that programming is easier to do independently as opposed to collaboratively. But when you think about the K through 12 space, really, I mean, we would do a number of competitive analyses, and I honestly was not very impressed by a lot of the products that schools were using. And in that, I'm not trying to toot Khan Academy's horn, because Khan Academy has a lot of room to grow as well. Because ultimately, what technology should be doing in a pedagogy sense is trying to foster greater human-to-human connection and human-to-human interaction, as opposed to human-to-machine interaction. And so I think it's particularly challenging to do that, especially in the pandemic, right? Especially when you have the massive inequities that we're seeing with just even among the classroom, right? Some kids can't get online. Some kids actually can't turn on their video camera because they just don't have the ability. It's not appropriate. It's not a possibility where they are, right? They're in a very small house with a number of other people, for example. They have to be on mute. There are certain things that come up that you have to think about the whole cultural context, right? So that's that's what makes it really challenging to answer this question. I think in general, if I could wave a magic wand and I would say everybody is on the same playing field, everybody has the same Wi-Fi connection, the same kind of space consideration, etc. There have been talks about something like the Dynabook, for example, or not the Dynabook, the Diamond Age, from Neil Stephenson, is talking about one of the core aspects of this story is having this almost this like interactive encyclopedia children's book, kind of one size fits all, that this child interacts with. Something like that is in many ways like the dream of an ed tech company, is to get that kind of dialogue happening and that kind of relationship. My fear is that the educational technology platforms that we'll see will continue to alienate as opposed to bring us together, bring us closer together. And so I would be eager to see more solutions that consider how do you bring social emotional learning into the equation, right? How do you think about kids interacting with other kids to not only learn about the core skills, but also learn how to be a good person, a good human? You learn how to do that when you're in school in a classroom setting. So these are really tricky things that makes the landscape of education, and particularly online education, so challenging, especially when you think about something as broad as the elementary school, kind of grade school level.
I mean, you spent quite a lot of time researching this topic, of course, many other topics. I feel like in this time, there are many teachers, both people like me, who are saying, where are all these bright minds that can solve these issues? And I feel like, I feel like you're one of those bright minds. And so here I have you, and I can ask you that question. If you would start, and again, you waved your magic wand, everybody has the same Wi-Fi. If you would start an edtech company, you said all the edtech companies out there, they're not completely doing it right. There is like this magic solution of this diamond book, or what you just mentioned. But realistically, with the technology that we have today, if you would start an edtech company, how would it look like, and what would it do differently than the companies that are out there currently?
Yeah, I would. I mean, first off, thank you. And also, this is such a hard question. I would think about it on first, I would kind of break down the problem into what are the goals, right? What are the goals that we're trying to achieve, right? And so if we rewind I would ask you what your goals are, right? Are your goals just to disseminate knowledge? Is it to, and how do you think that is? Is it just, I want to get the information into the learner's head, right? Or is it, when you're thinking about kids, is it, I want them to learn social cues and how to interact in dialogue with each other. There's so much more context that makes it really challenging at the child level, right? So if I say,
but I guess we can summarize that the goal is to replace schools, or maybe not replace them, but kind of spend less time in school would be a better goal. Some way where technology can actually replace this archaic thought of pretty much, sorry to say it for me, of course, but school felt like prison to me. And it's not the first time that I've heard school felt like prison. And so I guess that's the goal. How do you replace school in a way that it doesn't feel like prison, yet the knowledge is there? Obviously what happened during the pandemic is not a solution. Kids staying at home, not having the social independence of friends, developing themselves socially. So that's not a solution. But I guess a good goal could be replacing schools, but not in a way that happened during the pandemic.
Yeah. So let me reiterate my disclaimer and say that it massively depends. And there's so much more to the answer than just this. but I will try to answer in the sense that I would focus on, at least in the way that you described your experience in school, I would focus on personalized education. And by that I mean going in, I would try to understand, like, what are you like as a kid, what were you excited about? What did you actually like doing? Right? So I don't know, maybe it was playing video games or playing
Yeah,
sports,
for instance.
right?
Yeah.
I would take those contexts and say, how do I actually apply those to the educational material that you have to learn? It kind of reminds me a little bit about like this. There was like a Walt Disney movie, like it was just an old one where you were actually learning geometry through playing, like Daffy Duck playing pool. And it was just like, I have to make this shot, so I need this angle and this angle and this angle. And I just remember I was very different. I actually really enjoyed school. But I remember being glued to that because it was so engaging to me. Like, it was cartoons, it was Disney, and then I liked playing pool, or I liked watching pool. Sometimes it was on TV. So it was a way of taking something that I intrinsically enjoy and trying to translate it to something that is new, a new concept, etc. So, waving a magic wand, here's like a high level solution or algorithm or idea along those lines. Have every kid come in, try to understand more about them, build a profile about them. What do they like doing? What do they hate doing? And then personalize the things that they need to know, that the school system says they need to know, to all of those things that they're interested in. If a kid only wants to play basketball, how do you teach them everything they need to know about basketball, right? They need to learn reading comprehension. Well, can you pick texts that talk about basketball? They need to learn physics. Well, how do you shoot a ball? Like, what's the parabolic form that happens? Like, how do you do that? And you do it for every kid, right? Because not every kid's interested in basketball. You might have someone else who's, I don't know, interested in ice cream. All they care about is ice cream, right? So that to me is like the one of the more interesting avenues, and again gets back to that motivation component, right? You weren't motivated to learn in school, right? But so how do you get someone motivated to learn in school? How do you take something where right now the mechanism that we have, the incentive system is set up in a way where it's like, get an A, gotta get an A, gotta get an A so I can get into another school, so I can get a degree, so I can get a job. So there are all these things, right? And through that, we lose the love of learning because we're so focused on hitting those milestones, right? It happened to me, for example. There were certain points in time. It happens to everybody. There are certain points in time in my educational process where I was just like, I'm actually really interested in this material, but I'm so stressed out about getting this mark on this grade that I have just lost my interest in learning it, right? So I'm just doing it because I need to, right? And so removing those, I would say they're kind of artificial, the societal kind of measures that we have. So it's a thorny problem because you can't just, those things still matter in our society, yet they run completely counter to, in my opinion, the way that we actually should be learning, which is for the love of it, right?
So, kind of that solution is the first time I actually heard that solution, and it seems like such a good solution as well. But you could, I guess, start with one of the easiest classes in school, which would be something like history, where you could create every month you'd go through a different level with your class, or every week. So you have like 50 levels. I don't know how many weeks school goes for. And then every week you're dealing with the First World War, the Second World War, the history of like America, history of Europe, and then through that you actually interact with characters, learn about historical figures, learn about the presidents of the US and America. So that kind of game, like an Assassin's Creed of Prince of Persia style, would probably go crazy all over the world.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely an outlet and an option. And as you're talking, there may be some of those disciplines or some of those topics where it becomes increasingly difficult to translate, right? You have to learn history, you have to learn about certain wars, certain acts that happen. How does basketball fit in? Sometimes it doesn't work, right? So, but more often than not, in every other subject, in every other topic matter, whenever you can, you make the translation happen. And then when you can't, you think more broadly, going back to what matters or what's interesting to the kid or the person. We all have varied interests. There are many things that we like. There are probably things that we like more than others, right? So it's kind of going down that decision tree of like, okay, you're not into basketball, but you're into video games, right? Or you're not into video games, but you love watching TV. It's like, okay, how do we make learning history like watching TV, right? Or watching, so thinking through, what is the prioritization of my interests, and then ultimately like trying to go through and make that kind of algorithmic decision tree happen in a very personalized way.
Wow, this is definitely a topic you can explore for many hours. But I'm so happy you mentioned it. It is kind of so logical, yet the first time I heard it, and of course you want to put certain subjects. The personalization, I guess, is not yet with the technology of today possible, or it would just not be profitable, I guess, as a company. But maybe in the future would be, and maybe somebody's listening and thinking of how to create a game out of it. But I want to go back a little bit. 20 years ago, I guess when we were studying, it was very much like get an A, get into a good university, you'll get a good job and a good salary. Nowadays, I feel like we have gone through the age of revering entrepreneurs. We've gone through the age of like crazy funding cycles. Blockchain now is going crazy. People are becoming millionaires with Bitcoin. And somehow, because technology is growing so fast, schools can't keep up. And so your A is now not associated anymore to a good salary. You've researched in the last couple of years a lot of these things. Do you find that there's less interest in school, that there's more pressure on school because of all these changes, or not?
Yeah. So I think we're seeing, I think we're in a bubble, right? The two of us are in a bubble, and our world, we're seeing crypto millionaires, we're seeing tech exploding, we're seeing certain things. I think for most of the population in the Western world, getting A's, getting higher level degrees still statistically leads to better jobs, right? But that range is narrow, right? So I think you're still seeing the importance of an education, the importance of even a higher level education. What I have seen, which is not unique to my perspective, right, is we're seeing a massive reckoning of higher level education now. The undergraduate, graduate degree programs, especially in the fields that are changing so rapidly and don't have the kind of infrastructure in place to support that rapid change, right? In the sciences, for example, you can't be a doctor without an MD, right? You can't do certain disciplines without a higher level degree. You can't be a lawyer without a JD. You have to pass the bar. There are certain disciplines where it's like, okay, those are not changing anytime soon. But like, for example, in design school, in art school, you're seeing the emergence of like, I'm actually talking to students who are like, should I go to get a graduate degree or should I just do a boot camp, right? I could learn the same skills, or do I even need to go to a boot camp? Could I just like try and apprentice with someone and get the portfolio, etc.? And so I think this has always been something in tech in particular. And I think you're starting to see I'm finally seeing, or what I believe to be seeing is almost like a ripple effect into other disciplines and other domains, right? schools are going bankrupt. Programs are shutting down. Enrollment is down because the pandemic and no one, online learning, it doesn't stack up to the tuition fees. But two, you're just seeing, a reckoning of like, do I really want to get myself in debt? Do I really want to do these things? And so I think the institutions at place are challenged right now. And it is really challenging disciplines as well, as we're starting to see certain things get more lenient, for example, especially when you think about equity and inclusion and it's a privilege to be able to afford to go to get a higher level degree. It's a privilege to even take out a loan to do that, right? And so you're seeing changing requirements. I'll talk about IBM Research, for example, right? That's an organization that it's a subset of corporate research, and IBM in particular required a terminal degree in order to a graduate or a terminal degree in order to be a researcher, right? In my time, you saw that alleviate to the point where, well, they still didn't let you be a certain type of researcher without a PhD or an MFA or some kind of terminal degree, but they did allow engineers to come in with just an undergraduate degree, for example. So a very old institution like that, they're starting to change the requirements, right? And so I think you are seeing various things happen in the space. You're seeing new ways of alternative economic structures that are coming about, especially when we think about what's happening in, dare I say it, the Web3 space. And it really is having effects on how people are just making bigger decisions.
How do you see, can you explain Web3 to people listening in, and how do you see the future with Web3? The good thing that you caught on with that.
I mean, I am just getting into this space. And so the way that I would describe it from the way I've learned is it's, whereas Web 2 was really kind of the centralized platforms, Web 3 is moving in these more decentralized ways, decentralized, more autonomous ways. And you're seeing it with, new token economies, new coins that are coming out. You're seeing with the smart contracts and, DAOs. And you're basically seeing a very strong rise in a certain type of ethos. I would say this kind of, it's very anarcho-capitalist. It's almost like a very libertarian kind of, I'm going to try and move things forward in that respect, especially with Ethereum and NFTs and non-fungible tokens, and the underlying technology has allowed a lot of that to happen. There's a certain aspect of Web3 that I've been particularly interested in, drawn to, and am exploring a little bit more of, which is more of the I would say, the emancipatory potentials of Web3, blockchain, of actually creating more socialist structures, right? More communal living, more sharing economies, so it's really...
How?
So you're seeing like DAOs, for example, distributed autonomous organizations. You can think about a cooperative structure where you have one worker, one vote. And if you look at a lot of cooperatives and worker cooperatives, and one of the main reasons they fail is because it gets too onerous to do that, right? If everybody's talking about a mundane decision and you have 50 people in a cooperative, I don't want to spend a few hours or nights trying to get a decision for something that is so mundane when we need consensus to happen. So if you have an automated way of making decisions that, you have consenting individuals happening, you could scale that kind of platform more easily, right? You have the rise of certain currencies that are coming up that are actually trying to create stable coins, stable currencies, right? So if you think about the US dollar, it's an inflationary currency. So $20 that I have today is worth a lot less 50 years from now. Whereas Bitcoin and different cryptocurrencies right now are deflationary. If I had 20 Bitcoin back in 2012, it's worth a heck of a lot more today, right? And so there are certain currencies, it's now allowing for currencies to happen where people are exploring with stable currencies where my purchasing power actually just remains flat. So, what I have today is worth the same tomorrow, which is actually very empowering when we think about those who are not as fortunate, right? Inflation is quite detrimental. And so I'm starting to explore different avenues like that, thinking through things like platform socialist models, aspects of that. That's been something that's very nascent in the Web3 space, and something that I'm really interested in, how they're dividing and how they're really splitting. And a lot of what we're hearing is the Ethereum, the NFT, this kind of idea, which has merits, right? So if you think about blockchain, for example, you think about artists producing work on the blockchain. One of the benefits of the blockchain is the attribution, right? Proof of work. Not proof of work, but provenance. So right now, the traditional art market happens in a way where if I make a painting and I sell that painting to you, that's the transaction. But you sell that painting for a lot more value. As the artist, I get nothing back on that, right? So now there's a form of attribution, which I think is a real benefit of I can actually continue getting value out of the resale. So if we think about artists existing within capitalism, right, it's something that brings more agency to the artists. The other thing that it does within capitalism, or another economic model, is if I create a piece of digital art and then you're an artist and you take it and you remix it and then you create some other, I get credit. I'm credited. You can see that it was inspired by this person, right? And so something that happens in artist circles that's can be quite frustrating is someone's like, oh, you totally ripped my idea or my work. And so now you have an audit trail of all of that thought and how it's been iterated on over time, which can be really empowering.
Well, when you look at, you mentioned DAOs. I've been also exploring it in the last couple of months. We actually had somebody who talked about crypto on the last podcast. Mostly DAOs currently are used for creating video games, metaverse games, play to earn games, entertainment. I would summarize it. I've heard of DAOs for TV shows, very creative. But when you look at obviously your background, which is educating people, how do you see a decentralized economy combined with education? Does that work somehow? Do I maybe not see it? Or?
That's a good question. I haven't thought too deeply about education with that, but you think about distributing decision-making power. That's really what I think about when I think about DAOs. And you have impact DAOs, for example, that could be like philanthropic, right? So you think about the infrastructure that supports education, and you can start to think a little bit more deeply about how certain things can play into a DAO in order to think about how different educational institutions are funded, right? So especially when you think about things like more, some of the things that I've been interested in are like more equitable voting structures, like quadratic voting, for example, where my voting power diminishes the more power I have to vote, which often corresponds to the more money I have to vote. It diminishes over time if I say I'm going to vote for all of this, but I can also have percentage of votes that are applied in different ways. and so it can make decision making a little bit more, I think, more interesting, because you don't necessarily have the trade-offs that educational institutions are often faced. Well, if we put money here, we can't put money there, and here it's, actually, well, could we come up with different percentage distributions that weren't possible before, for example? Can we start to pool? Yeah.
So it would pretty much make the bureaucracy way more efficient, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely.
I think that's a that's a good thing to work towards already. We're kind of nearing the end already, but before we get there, I'd like to kind of ask you if there's something you'd like to mention, a topic that we haven't discussed, that you want to still talk about. What would it be?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk briefly about some of the work that I've been doing since leaving Khan Academy. I think that's something that is very nascent. I joined a new nonprofit initiative and foundation called One Project that's looking at the global transition to more equitable, ecological, and effective systems of economics and governance. And I think a lot of that is that move was inspired by, I think, what I mentioned to you early on, which is, I was working on these educational problems, and some of them felt meaningless if kids can't get online, right? Kids can't get access to this education. And, if you think deeper about some of the ecological issues around climate crisis that we're facing, equity issues around the rising wealth gap that we're facing, and just like effectiveness, like our inability to make decisions, in the States, it's almost like we're almost at a stalemate with decision making all the time that ends up happening. I started to really, question a lot of the platforms that are built on top of capitalism. And it had me thinking about just different forms of economic structures and economies, and how things have been tried differently before, and how things could be different, right? And so that's something that I've been exploring in March in this very new nonprofit startup, very small nonprofit startup, kind of very in an R&D space. And so maybe starts to combine and intersect some of the themes that we've been talking about, because it does bridge things like education and, Web3, the potentials of Web3 for decentralization, right? So that's one thing that I'd like to mention, is just, or explore perhaps, is the infrastructure that supports even the conversation we're having today.
How are you going to practically solve that issue, though?
I think very good question. One that is currently being explored, which is even to say the process in which we do things, right? It's deeply questioning that process. I think there are interesting communities that have been doing things differently for decades, hundreds of years, perhaps. There's a federation of cooperatives in the Basque Country in Spain called Mondragon. They're the communities like the Zapatistas in Mexico, who are living in these kinds of post-capitalist communal ways. And so starting to think through, are there ways of being in the world? And so it starts with deep listening, right? And trying to understand, what are people doing? What are people saying? And really interrogating kind of the perils of this kind of state of hypercapitalism that we live in today, right? What's going wrong, and how do we start to get to root issues as opposed to symptoms, right? We see so many impact companies, nonprofit, for-profit, that are really looking at putting band-aids over solutions, right? And there's no criticism on that. I think that's very much needed. I think it just becomes a question of like how can we start to interrogate that more deeply, and how do we get to root causes. So starting right now in a very heavy research stage, and that involves both primary and secondary research in the form of talking to people, talking to communities who are living in very different ways, reading a lot of the theory that's been put out, and creating speculative design work, honestly, trying to explore certain projects, even like the Cybersyn project in Chile that happened in the 70s, was looking at scaling socialism in a very digital way. It was kind of ahead of its time. So certain things like that, are there lessons learned from those types of experiments, and what was good about those experiments, what was not as good, what's good about certain different types of structures that have been tried throughout history.
Makes sense. Really like that. We're kind of coming to the end. I think we're over time already, but I want to thank you for being here with us, sharing your knowledge, and I want to kind of roll out the red carpet for you. Is there anything you'd like to promote, share? Where can people find you?
Yeah. Well, first off, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. People can find me on Twitter and Instagram. I'm Rarar, Rarar. It's a nice little palindrome there. If you want to follow up my updates, I'm doing some writing that's coming out. So there's a couple pieces that'll be out soon. Project's not public yet, but check social media for that. I've got a piece opening up at a show at the Moscow Museum of Applied Art next week. So you'll see updates for those in my social media handles. And I would just encourage people to stay tuned on one project. Like I said, we've been pretty quiet, but you'll probably be hearing some more updates from us in the coming year.
Nice. Any last words for the listeners?
Oh, no, I don't have any last words other than just I hope everybody is staying safe, sane, and healthy, and really just trying to live in ways that are true to themselves. It's a really difficult time to be human right now, in many ways, and so I just wish you all peace, and just wishing everybody to impart kindness on everybody else and patience.
I think that's a great way to close it. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, and maybe we'll see you in a future episode as well.
Great. All right. Thanks so much.
If you liked this episode, you can check out our most recent one here. And if you haven't already, make sure you click here to subscribe and see the next one. But if you're interested in more tips and tricks, then make sure to join our Facebook group, where you can find thousands of like-minded people and you get direct access